Hello and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, hosted by social housing recruitment specialist Matt Baird.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, episode 195 or 96, something in that remit. A big welcome today to James Batchelor, who's joining us for an Alertacall-led special that we're discussing today, aimed at senior leaders. And the idea behind today's discussion is to share some of the insight and thoughts that James has had from speaking with multiple housing leaders over the last, peaking under 12, 18 months. There are some big lessons he's learned from speaking with 50 housing leaders, and we're looking forward to kind of engaging today and sharing some of those thoughts and insight. My name's Matt Baird. I've been running this platform now for the last 4 years. This is something which has grown and grown with massive help from Alertacall, who are our kind of keynote sponsor for the year. So huge thank you to them for all of their support. But as I say, today is about focusing on some of those lessons heard, some of those lessons learned, and kind of hopefully with the audience we've got discussing and deep diving into whether we agree with some of them, what we can do to maybe combat some of those thoughts, but also what we can do to really try and make changes that are so vital to the sector. So James, I'm going to pass over to you to make your own introductions and to, I guess, highlight some of the thoughts you want to share today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Matt. That's great. So actually, thank you for everybody coming along, because actually I'm not going to do most of the talking today. I was kind of hoping to raise some of the themes that we've come across talking to senior leaders and really get you guys talking and seeing what you think about some of these topics. But I'll kick it off just by explaining for a minute or two who I am and how I ended up speaking to so many social housing providers this year. So I'm James. I'm a technologist who's been working in social housing for about 20 years because of something which happened to my own grandmother. And like many older people, she was one of these ladies that point blank refused to wear a panic button around her neck and wrist when I suggested it to her. In fact, she told me she wasn't old enough, despite being 86, and she categorically told me to get stuffed when I suggested it to her. So that got me thinking about two related challenges. And we're not going to be dwelling on these challenges today. I'm just giving you some context about how I ended up speaking to so many providers this year. Challenge number one is that an overwhelming majority of older and vulnerable people are not wearing those panic button things. Even if they have one, most people refuse to wear them. So yes, they do have value, and that's overstated. And the second thing that I realized in trying to work with my own grandmother is that even if somebody had a panic button, if they were unconscious, confused, or incapacitated in some way, they might not press it anyway. So unless somebody was proactively establishing contact with them, they might be left isolated, chronically lonely, and in the event of an incident, maybe on the floor for days and days, or even weeks, or even years, like the terrible incident which you folks might have picked up on in the press the other year with Sheila Cilioni, who was found after 2 years. Now, my response to that was twofold. I invented some technologies and services to help housing providers have better two-way engagement, and I'm going to show you what those look like just for 60 seconds in a minute. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll do that now, just so we've got that bit out of the way. So one of the things that we ended up working on was technology like this. So what we do is we help housing providers like you folks put a touchscreen into the homes of older and vulnerable people. So for example, Places for People have recently deployed just over 3,000 of these into their sheltered housing. And this enables you to message your customers, for your customers to message you really easily through an interface which is designed for them, for customers to self-report repairs or request calls back from repairs teams, self-report ASB, participate in TSM surveys, check the status of their account and confirm their occupancy, and a whole bunch more. And that's blended with access to contact from a team. So when this stuff kind of kicked off with my grandma 20 years ago, I set about working on that. But I also, and this is more pertinent, started talking to housing providers, both housing associations and local authorities, about how they could prevent undiscovered deaths in their properties more holistically. What are the kind of things we can do? I guess the one thing to recognise about when I started that 20 years ago is that most people didn't want to talk about it at all. It was quite a taboo subject. So getting anyone to open up about this issue around undiscovered deaths was really difficult. But the good news is, I think because of regulation forcing better two-way contact, and because of these high-profile cases in the media, and because of the wake-up that I think the lockdowns created around isolation and loneliness, housing providers over this last year have been much more open to talking to me about it. And actually, I've had over 50 meetings with senior leaders, including chief execs, housing directors, ops directors, and more, not just about preventing undiscovered deaths, but they were very free-form conversations where we touched upon everything in housing. Right, so what we're going to talk about today is 5 of the themes that emerge from those conversations, and I'm going to go down them one by one, tell you what we heard, and I'd be really interested in your input as to what your experiences of those themes were. By the way, the interviews I was having with people in the chats led to the production of this guide. So this is a guide called Preventing Undiscovered Deaths and Increasing Customer Contact, and it's got over 30 ideas for housing associations that they can implement, practical ideas around how you can reduce these incidents in your properties, how you can increase customer contact, what the social drivers are. So Matt, perhaps if anyone's interested off the back of this call, we could send a PDF of this round and people could forward it on to their colleagues. So look, we're not even here to talk about older people specifically or preventing undiscovered deaths. I was just giving you some context about why I was chatting to so many people. So let me start with the first thing that CEOs in particular were saying to us. And by the way, we had conversations about assets, about bond markets, about investments, but the themes I'm bringing up today are predominantly themes around human beings, leadership development, and how we go about delivering better customer services. Now, the first thing we came up with was this, that several of the CEOs we spoke to, and it was mainly CEOs bringing this up, felt that more so than any other time in their careers, and some of these people had been working in social housing for 25 years or more, that residents were living in extreme poverty. So it was really striking for the CEOs that we were chatting to, with some saying that they'd never seen anything quite like it in their careers, and that was bringing about quite a lot of intense challenges in the sector. In fact, one of the CEOs that we spoke to said that in their geography, it felt like it was increasingly kind of becoming Dickensian. And there's lots and lots of reasons why people are struggling at the moment, not just in social housing and beyond, and we can perhaps touch upon some of these themes when we get chatting. Now, there was really ultimately a strong sense that only really successive governments could do something about this. You know, tackling poverty on this scale is not something that's in the remit or capabilities of a single housing provider fixing. But those CEOs were racking their brains to try and figure out ways they could alleviate this in some way for the people living in their properties. So I guess that is the first theme that I want to surface today. What is your experience of your customers at the moment? Are you feeling that they're under more pressure than ever? Do you see that? And what are you guys doing to tackle it? And does anybody have any bright ideas?
I'll wait to see if people want to either use raise hand function or can just wave at me. You can put something in the chat, whichever's easiest. I certainly know from, as you'll know, James, I'm chair of the board at St Anne's Hostel, which is part of the Spring Housing Group, and we're certainly finding huge issues in and around Birmingham and Warwickshire at the moment. I think there are challenges with housing benefit is a massive one. I think trying to kind of get that right and really work out what is housing benefit, what isn't, what we can claim, what we can't. There's a massive issue around employment. I think, go back a few years, there were far more vacancies available than certainly there are now. And then I think there's also just this issue of we're seeing a lot of landlords that previously we'd worked with in the supported housing space at any rate pulling out of the sector because of it not being financially viable anymore. So we're more reliant on private sector landlords or whatever. The rents are so high, it doesn't work and doesn't match up. And so we're seeing homelessness increase. So we're certainly seeing from our side, it's that miasma of both. You've got the housing benefit side, you've got the issues that you're having more broadly around private sector rents and where they're costing, and then landlords not seeing it as a viable opportunity maybe that they once were. So we're just losing stock for those most in need. I don't know if that's resonating at all with anything you're hearing.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, also one of the large providers that we work with up here in the north. I was chatting with those guys, and they were saying that most of their GN referrals, into general needs properties, and unlike 15, 20 years ago, most of their referrals into their properties now are from people with actually quite complex needs as well. So, there was this kind of idea that, there used to be, we have general needs sheltered and supported housing, and the lines between all of those things are becoming increasingly blurred because there's a huge number of people with complex needs living in general needs. And they were kind of there scratching their heads, wondering how on earth they were actually going to be able to cope with that. But whilst also talking about the fact that these people are more compromised than ever because of rising inflationary costs. Everybody on this call will recognise how much the cost of living has gone up over the past few years. We're almost bored talking about that. But I don't think it's just the cost of living. I think other statutory services are being eroded, and we might touch upon that in a minute.
I agree. Hazel, we'll bring you in.
Yeah, sorry, it's on the topic, but it's a bit off-piste actually. I have been asked to deliver for the Board Development Agency a webinar, which is called The Real Cost of Living, and the impact of poverty on social housing. So, James, I would love to come and pick your brains about some of the things you got from the CEOs, because I've got a perfect platform there to spread some of the themes that you picked up, to try and get boards really aligned with this, because I think quite often we forget the boards can have quite an influence on, and they should have that level of influence. But quite often when we're looking at things, the board members aren't consulted as such. So I really want to talk to you, James, about your findings from your conversations that you've had, if I'm able to pinch some stuff and I can then promote that.
Yeah, I'm pinch away. There's no protectable intellectual property here. I mean, yeah, so this idea of actually properly thinking about what the impact of the increasing cost of living is on people, I don't think should be sniffed at, because financial stress on families is elevating mental health problems for people. It's creating problems with people obviously maintaining their financial relationship with their social housing provider, which is an impact on the provider. It's elevating levels of ASB. There are correlations with financial stress and increased levels of domestic violence in properties. It's not, is it just about, okay, are my tenants, are my customers able to meet their bills with me as a housing provider? It's, my goodness, what are all the other effects going to be in our communities unless we get a handle on this? And it's a big problem, isn't it? It's a difficult problem. What we are hearing, talking to some of those organisations, is an increased investment in two things actually: tenancy sustainment. That a lot of these organisations are having to think, much more carefully about how do we financially support, advise, and consult with our customers, and they're kind of investing more heavily in those functions. The second thing, as a consequence, and we might touch upon this actually, is an increased level of investment in safeguarding. So some of the big housing providers that I've been meeting on and off over the years have, over the past 12, 24 months, really doubled down on investment in safeguarding teams and identifying customers at particular risk, not just financial risk, but safeguarding risks full stop. And some of the big providers that we've been talking to have felt it need to create bursaries and funds for customers in extreme distress that customers can access. as well, which is very complicated to administer. Who should get 50 quid or 100 quid or 150 quid of relief? Who should get some relief from their bills? That there's a can of worms there, isn't there, in terms of equality of access to support like that. I was wondering, is there anybody else on this call who is customer facing, who is seeing this for themselves? I'd be interested. If nobody puts their hands up, it's absolutely fine, but it does mean you'll have to hear me keep talking.
I'm gonna wait, see who's brave. Hoping someone will dive in.
Maybe not.
Maybe
Too much of a thorny subject. Hazel,
It's also interesting, just on the point you mentioned there, and I had and I'm not going to mention them because it was a very, very kind of off the record conversation with somebody up at the Housing Community Summit who is a senior exec in housing. And it touches actually on some of the points you just mentioned there around who gets relief, who doesn't, where does this go, and the kind of allocation of funding. And someone said, well, actually part of the problem is that we've got people in social housing who don't need it.
Yeah.
And we've got people who are desperate for social housing that need it more than those who are living in it. But because of the way we do tenancy agreements and the rest of it, we're kind of a little bit stuck. And there was somebody who mentioned that their daughter had just picked up a fantastic job, and they were really proud of the fact their daughter lived in social housing and the rest of it. And it took a moment of going, well, then do they still need the social housing? And that's a really, really difficult conversation to have. I'm not saying, goodness me, if you start then succeeding in life, that means you should lose your home or something to that effect. But that balance around where the funding goes and how it's allocated and who gets support is a really, really challenging one. So I'm not surprised to hear that chief execs are mentioning it to you as well.
Yeah, I think it's super complex, and there's no easy answers. It's just it's amazing to me that, and look, I'm not saying anything that people don't already know, that here we are in 2025. Are we the 7th richest country in the world? And people are experiencing, extreme levels of poverty. And who sees that? The closest? Well, it's the neighbourhood officers, the housing officers, the frontline team members of housing providers. And I dare say, that's having quite a substantial impact on how they're able to perform in their roles.
Well, so I think that brings you on quite nicely to your second point that came up anyway, didn't it, in terms of from your learnings?
Yeah, it does actually. So yeah, we'll segue into that. So what was the second thing that came up in these conversations? But by the way, so these conversations were 50 largely face-to-face conversations around the country, and we had conversations with some of the biggest housing providers in the country, right down to smaller housing providers with maybe only a few hundred homes. So we got a really broad spectrum. And I guess what was interesting is that the big providers and the small providers were essentially talking about the same things. It wasn't that the big providers had some fundamentally different challenge, though we'll touch upon that in a sec. So the second thing that came up was a recognition that there has been a fairly significant erosion of statutory services, of other services around social housing that historically might have supported what happened in social housing. So a really simple example is this, and it's not the one we'll dwell on, but emergency services like the police force are now much, much more difficult to get hold of, for example, to perform a safe and well check. So actually the threshold by which emergency services will come out and visit a property has gone up, and lots of housing providers would rely on services like that to some extent to come and attend properties and deal with locations where perhaps a tenant hasn't been seen for some period. Basically getting any form of emergency response has become increasingly difficult, and that is not because those police services want to be less responsive. It's because they're under an extreme amount of pressure themselves. They've had changes in their own funding regimes, and these issues around poverty and deprivation are the antisocial behaviour and the other societal problems that come off the back of them are affecting the police forces. But perhaps more pressingly, And this is a comment that came up from about 10% of the people that we talked to, which if you think about it, is quite significant. Might have been a little bit more. Was this idea that housing officers and frontline staff are kind of inadvertently performing, not in a structured and formal way, obviously, let's just make that very clear, but kind of taking on the roles that social workers would have been doing 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the amount of problems that they're being hit with on the front line dealing with tenants, one has gone up, two is more extreme, and actually customers with quite complex needs are not being able to access social workers anymore because the social workers, well, one, there's fewer of them, and two, they are dealing with the most intense and difficult cases. And I don't think I really understood the extent of this until we spoke to a local authority that was stockholding as part of this. And they told me that over 20 years, their staffing levels within the local authority had basically dropped about 80%. So for every 100 people employed, there's now 20 versus 20 years ago. And I challenged that with them and said, surely not, that it can't be that dramatic. And they were actually very open to suggesting, look, part of that might have been because they were overstaffed. Maybe there was some scope to trim the fat, as it were. But no, most of those staffing changes have impact upon their own frontline staff, people like social workers. So I think you've got frontline staff, housing officers, scheme managers, neighbourhood officers, neighbourhood coaches, whatever we want to call them. And let's face it, to some extent, people answering telephone calls in customer services contact centres now hit with the needs of very, very complex people. And that's making their jobs more demanding. So I know there aren't stacks of people on this call, but I guess the question I would ask, and Hazel, you might have something to say about this, because it feels like, with your safeguarding hat on as well. By the way, Hazel, since we were chatting a second ago, I've gone and found your LinkedIn profile, and I've read up on you. You'll know some interesting stuff, Hazel. So yeah, we should touch base after this call.
Definitely, thanks, James.
But I wonder what people do think. Have people come across this in their own organisations, and what are they doing about this demand on frontline staff?
Hazel, if you want to dive in, please feel free. Alertacall return as one of the keynote sponsors for the Social Housing Roundtable in 2025 into 2026, and we're delighted to have them back. Alertacall help as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. As you can see from this touchscreen I've got with me, Alertacall's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Call, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertacall work with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and their landlords. In 2022, Alertacall won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023, Alertacall won Housing Supplier of the Year. We're delighted to have them back with us throughout the course of this year, and please do go check them out on social media and LinkedIn to find out more. Thank you very much, Alertacall, for sponsoring us again.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably put my Ned hat on actually for this one. So I've recently joined Brighter Futures. If people don't know who they are, they're a very small housing association based in Stoke-on-Trent, but they do the sharp end that everybody else tries to divert away from. They are literally street homeless into hostels and homes. They have a pathway of going through homelessness. The work they do is incredible. They have women's services, outreach services, rough sleeper outreach, all the things that a lot of big providers these days actually try and divert they're trying to do more general needs and have more settled community stuff, whereas Brighter Futures are, this is their bread and butter. And I have to say, at the sharp end of what they're doing, there is a huge increase in everything relating to safeguarding, and also, the communication they have with the police is very much like the police almost reliant on Brighter Futures to deliver some of the services for them, to pick people up when something goes wrong. They even take them to the door of the hostel and things like that. They're not, they see that as the way to manage it. And I find that quite interesting, because we know from just walking around all our towns and cities and in our rural areas as well, that homelessness is increasing all the time. And I don't think we're getting the best response to it that we could get. And as much as we build those relationships with the other services, at the end of the day, we've got some people living in some absolutely dire situations in destitution, who aren't getting the support that they need. And as you mentioned, James, even when people living in general needs accommodation, they're not getting that support. The cost of living crisis, and with having COVID, which I know at one point we'll have to stop talking about, actually has increased people's complex needs that they have right across the piece, no matter what your circumstances are. And we just don't have the resources in play to really pull that through. And that's why I think things like what you're doing, James, with Alertacall, it's just another tool in your toolkit, isn't it? It's something else that you can draw on when you need to. And I don't think we've got enough tools in the toolkit that suit people's diverse needs and what they need today. And social services are silted up, let's be really honest. So their capacity to pick things up is just really, really challenging. And I know the thresholds get tighter and tighter every day. So it is a complete, it's one of those wicked problems, isn't it? I think so.
Yeah. Are you seeing then, Hazel, are you seeing kind of how housing providers are trying to respond to that with their frontline staff, or just people kind of just struggling to know what training to deliver, what support to give to frontline staff? Or do you see anybody doing anything radical with their frontline staff in terms of training them with psychotherapeutic techniques, stuff like that? And I know it's not their job. Their job, by and large, is funded from the housing benefit pot. So it's housing management. It tends to be at the front, but it doesn't mean that housing management can't be compassionate, and it can't be nuanced and skilled. Do you see anything happening in that respect, Hazel? Or is it just difficult?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think one of the problems that I would like to solve is that safeguarding is largely unregulated. Although you have safeguarding legislation for children and adults in the housing sector, we have a duty of care, but actually there's nothing that's really written into to say that you definitely need to do X, Y, and Z. And it becomes a bit of a topic when you're talking about safeguarding, where it's not a blame culture. So it's all about lessons learned. So again, it has a slightly different tilt to it. But you see some fantastic work. I'm just going to pull on WHG as a really good example. They go in and they've trained some of their colleagues to deal with people who have diabetes and smoking issues and health issues. So that's somebody going that complete extra mile to really try and pick things up early and engage people with the services to prevent those things increasing over time. You look at Bromford, where I used to work, you've got your neighbourhood coaches. So they have really small patches. So, again, they get to know their customers. They're able to do that relational piece. They're much more hands-on than the old style housing officers. So I think it is pretty much a bit of a mixed bag how people deal with things. And again, that depends very much on your funding and resources, doesn't it? And what you're able to do. So
I did some work, goodness me, maybe a couple of years ago for Bromsgrove District Housing Trust, actually. And they introduced a new role, which effectively was a very old role. So you still had your housing officers and everything along those lines. But what they introduced was actually, they called them, they weren't called wardens, what were they called? It'll come to me in a bit. But their role was basically to go to some of the more difficult patches where there've been higher levels of ASB or whatever it would be, and just to kind of be there available on the street and walk around and get to know everybody in that more very, very small patches, but kind of more like an area rather than homes. And the idea was to get to know your local area better and get to be that presence, a bit like, I guess, James, on your thing, a bit like the Bobby on the Beat used to be. Yeah. And go around if there are smaller issues or there are challenges, and get to know so you can get ahead of it. Because, I mean, Hazel alluded there to the work that WHG have done. Some of their work in the asthma prevention stuff has been amazing, but the only way they've been able to get there is by partnering properly with the health partners in the local area. There's some amazing work with Black Country Health and the NHS there to go, right, let's stop the whole blame game. Let's stop this whole kind of thing of you should be doing this and you should be doing this and you should be doing this. So, right, well, what's the outcome we all need? And what can we do collaboratively to go, how do we make this work with the best that we can and use our community to do it? And I think that's still missing from housing.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Matt, to some extent. Without question. Interestingly, Hazel, you mentioned about something along the lines of it not necessarily being, it's not de facto the responsibility of a housing provider to be kind of doing all this stuff. So it's a bit complicated, complex, or something along those lines. Well, interestingly, one of the chats we had with one of the big London providers, they were very acutely aware of the Care Act 2014. So there is the Care Act 2014, and most housing providers that I speak to are not aware of it, kind of in any way, shape, or form. Actually, when I bring it up in conversation, I'm sure there are safeguarding leads in these providers that do know about it, but I just tend not to bump into them myself that often. So, housing providers need very clear safeguarding policies, and they do have a responsibility to protect vulnerable adults, and they're not outside the scope of the Care Act. So, if anybody on this call hasn't heard about the Care Act, it is worth coming off this, giving it a Google, and reminding your colleagues that you are actually, you do have a responsibility towards it. You are captured as essentially a quasi-public body to have those responsibilities. Well, look, that leads me. We might come back to this theme actually in a second, because I might change what we talk about, but I'll come back to something which is more quintessentially housing, which should probably not surprise anybody. So when asking these 50 housing providers, right, what is still the number one issue that drives them balmy, unsurprisingly, people are still talking about repairs, and that repairs related complaints are the number one source of ill feeling and stress to and with residents. Now, I don't think that would come as a surprise to absolutely anyone, but one of the shifts in the conversation this time round talking to people was that there was a much greater recognition that it might be because of a skills shortage. So even the larger organisations that we were talking to that are really robustly trying to build and flesh out their repairs functions are simply at a brick wall with trying to find tradespeople. It's just, I mean, and let's face it, whether you live in social housing or you live in your own private accommodation, I live in my own home. I can't get a blooming tradesperson, and that's picking up the phone and trying to ring 20 of them. So we do seem to have a national shortage of tradespeople. This problem is particularly concentrated in social housing, because if you're working for a social housing provider as a tradesperson, as a plumber or an electrician or a joiner, whatever, the likelihood of that tradesperson earning what they could earn as a private contractor is probably lower because these services are in demand. That puts a huge burden not only on housing providers, one, that how the heck do we recruit, two, what do we need to pay for these services. And I actually think that was quite a big topic. I would say probably a third of all the housing providers I talked to mentioned something along these themes. Now, interestingly, we discovered on the journey that Places for People, the juggernaut, which is Places for People, I mean, they've opened up their own training academy, which I believe they're calling Thrive. And I think they're at the start of their journey with it. But my understanding is, and go and check this out with them, is that they're building an academy to train people on a wide range of skills, everything from being a housing officer right through to being a plumber or an electrician. And they're wanting to open up that academy to other social housing providers and have it as essentially a shared resource across the sector. Matt actually hosted a great talk at the Housing and Community Summit the other day in Liverpool, where Rachel Crownshaw from Places for People was talking about just that. And that seemed to me, it's not a short-term solution, is it? Because no amount of academies are going to churn people out within 12 months. But it seemed like a good idea for the sector. So I just wondered, within your respective providers, are repairs still a hot button topic? And are you finding this difficulty in recruiting people is a real problem for you folks as well?
Sam, please come in.
You sparked me.
We got something. Yes.
Well, I was listening whilst trying to look at a strategy document around repairs. So I was kind of like, that's why I was off camera. I didn't want to look like I was typing and doing something else, but I was actively listening to you like a podcast. Sorry.
That's all right.
I think so. I work for Amplius, which is, for those who don't know, is the were previously Longhurst Group and Grand Union, so merged in December of last year. And Grand Union have an internal repairs team. Longhurst Group have not. And I feel quite new to housing, although I have been in housing nearly 5 years, because everyone who's worked in housing's worked in housing forever. And prior to that, I was in I worked in retail, and and the first project that I started on was repairs, responsive repairs, in a period during COVID. And you could already see that during COVID, whilst people were on furlough, lots of those tradespeople started to set up their own businesses.
Yeah.
And so, the likelihood is the only offer that they would ever make in future to a housing association or any of those like large main tier suppliers who are providing responsive repairs for the industry would be as a subcontractor. And you could tell they were already making more money. So, I'm kind of completely aligned to what you're saying. We hear from our providers that they also have the challenge. So where we do have, issues with works in progress and the need to extend the time that it's taking to get works in, they're struggling to get subcontractors.
Yeah.
And they're struggling to get recruits themselves in those large services that have been used historically. I do think it is quite a challenge. I've been thinking about the different ways to crack that. And, I think the old apprenticeship scheme, plumbers, multi-traders that used to be around are kind of reaching the point where they've previously probably been self-employed and are now at a point where they want to have a permanent job and are likely to carry on working for much longer than their predecessors and are much fitter than their predecessors. So I think there is an opportunity to bring people in, not just who are young, but to bring people in who are kind of, multi-trade, self-employed people who are, now they haven't necessarily considered working in housing as a permanent thing to do, but the having a permanent employer, not having to worry about submitting invoices to people, etc., is probably quite attractive to those guys now, and they can bring a lot to that younger workforce who are trying to learn. Because I think the challenge with apprentices is they're coming in to work around people who are also potentially quite young and new themselves. So I think there's a lot that could be offered by those people who you could bring back in.
I think that's all absolutely right, Sam. And I wonder if there's two things there. I wonder whether or not, housing providers could be in some way, and I know this is just like an idea floating around off the back of what you've just said, could be in some way supportive of people living in their communities that want to go and maintain self-employment and be self-employed, and perhaps provide them with retained income in some way, or coordinate access to self-employed people with these skills, but like you say, actively kind of recruiting them on the basis of life might just be easier for you, full stop, if you come and work for us, is also an interesting model. I think you should reach out, Sam, to, I think it's a chap called Andy over at Places for People who's running their academy, and share some of those thoughts with him, because whilst Places for People, will have a whole stack of their own ideas and in-house expertise, my experience in engaging with them is they're open to new models and new ideas, which is quite an exciting thing about working with them at the moment.
Can I ask a quick
I have
question?
an internal in my fact, whilst I was doing my research around trying to solve the problem. Actually, my brother's a plumber and he's 61. He's quite fit. He's been self-employed all this time, and when I talk to him about, I've got to, I quite often use him as my critical friend about overcoming some issues. And when he said to me, he's in Scotland, but he said, I'd really welcome the opportunity to go back into employment The issue has been that because I have been self-employed and I don't have a certificate or anything like that, I'm quite an old apprentice to be trying to get back in. And, do people want to employ people at 60? Unfortunately, there's a bit of a bias at the moment towards bringing people in.
From my recruitment hat, so like I say, I mean, that recruitment's the bread and butter. That's what I've done for 14 years, and I've always found that on one side you've got people saying we've got an aging workforce, we're worried about this, we're worried about that, and I completely get that. And obviously we can talk about Brexit and the loss of staff, and we can talk about the stigmatization, certainly that I recall going through school. If you were clever, you went to uni. If you weren't, you did a trade, was the mindset. That was just what it was like back in the 90s. And I kind of wish now I'd gone and done a trade, because I'd be far more employable.
I'd love to be a joiner.
It'd be far more useful as a skill set. And I think that's a huge part of it. One thing I wanted to quickly ask you, because you raised it there, which was interesting. You've merged two businesses, one which had a DLO and one which didn't. Culturally, and I guess also financially, is there a route that you've seen has been better for the business? I appreciate it's still early days, you're 9 months in post-merger, but have you found the use of having that internal DLO has helped kind of attract staff in a different way, or do you kind of think actually the contractor model for housing maybe worked a bit more positively? Have you seen a difference with the two? Case Management Solution Group, or CMSG, are the home of React, the UK's #1 case management system for ASB and community safety. We are delighted to have them as one of our key sponsors for Social Housing Roundtable 2025 into 2026. And with the ASB app now fully integrated to the platform, it allows residents to record, monitor and report issues directly to their case office in live time. What's not to love? CMSG are bringing simplicity back to case management, and I cannot recommend them enough and thank them for all of their support through this period and through the rest of the year. Thank you, CMSG, and do please go check them out on social media and on LinkedIn. Thank you.
I'm actually interestingly in a project at the moment that's comparing the two, to be able to look at them both. So I can't share too much. But when you do, there are marked differences in why there are benefits of those two things, aren't there? I mean, like, in the Longhurst model, we obviously didn't have the responsibility for a workforce, and all of the scheduling and planning and the hard work is actually passed on to someone else. But we wanted to be able to control how that felt in the community for people. So the feedback you get is very different when you have a internal repairs, a DLO, because people feel that is their landlord doing that thing for them. It's not someone else in a van. And I think as part of the procurement exercise to find our main suppliers that we have in at the moment, and I was actually saying we want to answer our own calls because we want people to feel like they're speaking to their landlord and that we're taking responsibility for that. But we also want you to feel our brand and our values when you visit people's homes as well. And that's quite difficult to get that kind of community feel, isn't it? And it was interesting when we started taking our own calls, even though the service was being delivered by other people, how the number of calls we got to tell us about everything that might be wrong with the home was far greater than what had been experienced by our suppliers when they took our calls, because they're actually speaking to their landlord. So, we're even the projections of how many, responsive repair calls are we going to get were wrong, because we were basing it on what was that like when you were calling someone who you just had as a call card number versus the sort of conversation you want to have when it's your landlord, So there are quite a lot of differences that I think that you find. And obviously having to look after a DLO means you have to think about van stock, and, the model is far more complex, isn't it? So I can see why it's been avoided. And there is obviously the challenge of having to do recruitment and everything else. So it's been really interesting for me to learn what's going on back office when I haven't necessarily had to consider that before. But I think, it is how it feels like owning that, and owning that for somebody who lives in a home is really important.
Yeah.
And the further you can go with ownership, the better. But how practical is that to be able to sustain that? And do you need a model that's the best balance of both? Because having, the sort of specialisms that some of the providers have to be able to fix roofs and drains and all the rest of it, you're always going to need a balance, aren't you?
Mm.
100%.
I don't think I've answered the question. I think I've been a bit political on that. As I learn more and we get further along it, I'm happy to kind of share. But at the moment, it's kind of, we're at a strategic point.
I think it's just interesting speaking to someone who's merging and doing the both. And James, I know you've got 2 more points you want to raise before we run out of time today, but I think that's really interesting, looking at that kind of utilization of stuff and actually the additional information you can get when the trust maybe mindset changes. It's been huge, hasn't it?
Yeah, learning from both is the biggest benefit, because as we now say, what do we need to do for customers? We have the experience of both models to make sure it's right for a customer.
Brilliant. James, over to you.
Well, there's a bit of a connection to the next two things I was going to surface, really, actually. There's now a bit of a theme emerging. I mean, so the next thing that people were talking about was that if you want to meet the demands of the regulator, particularly to achieve a decent kind of C grading, if anything else, but to fundamentally kind of for the sector to up its game in terms of customer services, full stop, which touches upon how we handle and deal with repairs and the things we've been talking about, that there seems to be an awakening in the big providers, in particular, that frontline staff, housing officers, neighbourhood coaches, scheme managers, are going to need a much higher level of leadership training, communications training, training on how to engage with and interact with customers. And also, they're going to need to be more empowered to make decisions for and actually take direct action on behalf of customers as well. So I think, there was a realization from several senior leaders that it's those people, the frontline staff, the feet on the street, that are going to have the biggest impact on customers' perceptions of the housing provider. And I think
that ties in, doesn't it, with what Sam just mentioned about the trade staff as well. They're kind of going, well, actually, if there are staff, suddenly there's a different perception. You can see there was Ashley mentioned in the chat that, and Ashley had to pop off, but she said, my 2 pence on this as the consultant in the arena. I've written endless reports over the last 2 years regarding economic and trade shortage forecasts, but even when equipped with this information, providers still don't have the budgets to invest. Where does it come from? And I think actually what's interesting, James, your point there is it's that long-term thinking is the biggest challenge housing has. So, well, if you're not going to invest now, you're going to be even more stuck in a few years. You need to invest in that leadership and ownership and accountability piece now if we're going to get to where we want to get to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I mean, what's an example? And this isn't unique to any particular housing provider at all, but we had senior leaders, housing directors talking to us about how, they've got customer angst. There's customer angst, but actually their feet on the street, their frontline staff out there dealing with customers, have simply, to some extent, been underinvested in for a very, very long period and don't know how to project a positive position on behalf of the housing provider. So the housing provider might actually be really working hard behind the scenes to fix a whole bunch of problems to do with repairs, to do with customer services, to making sure the right things happen at the right time. But actually the housing officers don't know how to communicate that. And a recognition that it's simply not good enough to send an email out to your housing officers or to use just to shove something on your LMS to say to your frontline staff, oh, we're doing X, Y, and Z, go and tell the customers what great work we're doing. You actually need to train people into how to communicate, how to talk positively, how to combat and deal with objections. Now, I've said this for years in social housing, and it doesn't get frowned upon nowadays anything like as much as it used to, but we actually have to be telling and teaching frontline staff members how to sell. And I don't mean selling products and services, I mean selling the vision of the future for the housing provider, so that when you've got a housing officer that's kind of under attack from I was going to say the name of a resident that popped into mind there, but I won't. So, when you've got somebody who's under attack by a very angry resident, frontline team members need to know how to deal with it, and end of story. So what we're seeing as well is housing providers going, do you know what? 15, 20 years ago, we might have considered our frontline team members almost as like, and please, nobody yell at me for saying this, but certainly not the most important aspect of our service delivery, right? Now housing providers are beginning to recognise they are the most important aspect of their delivery, and everything comes from those frontline team members. So I guess the question I was going to ask the group is, the housing providers that you work for or are connected with, do you see that sentiment too? And do you see housing providers suddenly realising that's a place for additional investment?
Sam, obviously, I can see you nodding along to some of that. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts there. Sorry to pick on you, it's only because your camera's on. But just I can see you nodding along. Some of that kind of resonate with what you're trying to do with that amalgamation piece you mentioned on?
I think that I was nodding more at the fact that, quite often I think leadership programs, conflict resolution, all those sorts of things are pitched at a kind of a leadership program to almost allow internal teams to work better together. And I was just I was agreeing with the sentiment of, imagine how difficult that is when you are, in a situation where you literally, the battle lines are drawn. I think that my experience of some of the people that I work with in tenancy enforcement and other areas, I'm in awe of how well they do this. But I think that's through personality and the way they naturally work than there is through frameworking and assisting with that sort of stuff. So I was just I was nodding in a question time audience type way of, that's a great idea.
Well, Sam, yeah, I think it is a great idea. And actually, you just mentioned then how in awe you are of how well some people cope with that. And it's a lot to do with their personality. So a lot like I've written this guide, Preventing Undiscovered Deaths. One of the guides I'm working on for next year is a guide about how you can be the best you can be at communicating and engaging with people face to face. Because over the years, I've interacted a lot with scheme managers on sheltered housing schemes and housing officers. And I've been struck by how, and look, these are big handfuls here. This is not exactly what I was going to say here. You'll have people that might have gone into those roles 10, 15, sometimes 20 years ago with the right attitude and personalities, and they've adapted and know how to handle the customers, but sometimes are not very well equipped to deal with change as a consequence. So they've got lots and lots of embedded ways of handling things, but plenty of things to learn from them. And then you seem to have this gap where housing providers are trying to recruit people into those roles who simply haven't got the experience and are not being taken through essentially a training and learning and development program that puts them in a good place to deal with any of it. And yeah, I'm a big advocate, Sam, that everybody at every level should be exposed to some basic leadership training, some basic comms training, how to talk about things positively. And for the sake of 1 or 2 days a year, or maybe 1 day a year for a frontline team member to be exposed to something like that, it could have quite a substantial impact on the customers and the customer's perception of the housing provider.
I think that academy that we were talking about for repairs probably belongs in the same thing, because I'm a parent of 3 children of different age groups. I think my eldest daughter is 28, my son's currently 15, and my daughter in the middle is 21. I think that the digital age that they've grown up in means they communicate in quite different ways, and quite often that's through social media, etc. I remember getting my first junior job working in an optician's where I was suddenly front facing, on a reception, and you learn there how to deal with customers, etc. I think that sometimes you can be very process driven in training, teach people the process of what to do, but how to do it actually is definitely fundamental. And these are, quite often young people who are being brought into situations that they've never had to resolve that sort of level of conflict, or
Yes.
and potentially, as much as they have the empathy, they're dealing with people who aren't normally in their social circles.
Yes,
So,
and not normally in their social circles, and culturally now very, very different.
yeah,
And I know we're leaning into stereotypes here, but there is an element of truth that, younger people are less inclined to hold face-to-face conversations with people,
yeah,
and hold telephone conversations, and to deal with conflicts more directly and face-to-face. But they're going to be put, if they're recruited into a housing officer role, they're going to be put front and center into having to deal with all that. And
yeah,
that actually scares a lot of people out of those jobs within 12 months of starting them.
yeah. And I don't think it is probably stereotyping. I think it is actually just a cultural upbringing of a digital group. So it's not that everyone's rubbish at it. It's just that it's not had to be in their psyche
really.
all their lives.
James, I know we're going into the last 2 minutes. I just wanted to make sure you had a chance to raise your last your fifth point, which ties into this quite nicely.
It does, and that is, and actually, the person who talked most coherently about this is actually Catherine Fox Rogers from Sanctuary, and she brought it up at an event the other day, but she wasn't the only person. And the point is this, is that to service customers in the way that the customers are going to expect to be serviced, and to run our businesses efficiently, we are going to have to grasp that technology has a role to play, both in terms of managing behind the scenes systems, and also communicating with our customers themselves. And customers are going to be increasingly accessing self-service tools, not just like the one I showed you earlier that we offer for older and vulnerable people, but all sorts of stuff is going to emerge. But actually, the level of technology competence in the sector, particularly with frontline staff, is actually very, very low. Right now, we don't need frontline staff to be able to, write complex spreadsheets, and deal with tech. We don't expect anyone to be a programmer. But actually, the point that was being made by a very significant number of the people we were talking to is they feel the need to invest more in technology competencies across their teams, and have technology competencies more embedded in induction, and learning and development, full stop. Because otherwise, how are we going to support a technologically enabled customer base if we don't have the right technology skills internally? So that was really the last point I was going to make, which is the sector is behind the curve on getting its people ready for the emergent technologies that are coming. What are we going to do about it?
Ties into a point Sam made, and I think there's an assumption, isn't there? Just because young people are out there using the tech, or people of any age, that we just assume that they can use it. Yes, okay, we need to train tenants, but surely our staff know, and that assumption is dangerous.
It is dangerous, and I've been out visiting housing officers and scheme staff for a variety of different housing providers this year, and frankly, the level of passion and desire to do the right thing by the customers and deliver a great service is great, but actually the level of technology competence is actually extremely low. And as we move into a world where a significant amount of engagement is going to be proxied through technology, something needs to be done. We're running out of time. We've got 2
I'm
minutes.
going to say, James, how would you like to kind of wrap up, and what would you like to leave people with today?
Well, look, what I'd like to leave people with is, look, these are not the only things that emerge. So Hazel, very much up for a conversation. If anybody wants to pick up these themes with me, and I've got dozens more. So by the way, when we got the 50 meetings, we also had another 150 letters back from housing providers as well. That isn't because anybody wanted to talk to me, but it's because actually we work very closely with Dame Esther Anson, and Esther sent a letter out encouraging people to participate in this process as well, which is one of the reasons we got a really good response rate. So I'm very happy to talk to anybody about these themes. Meet up in person over a coffee if there's a will to do that. I am James Batchelor. I can be found very easily on LinkedIn. I'm going to ask.
Lentils MBE. I think that will help find you.
Okay, thank you for that, Matt. you need to stop doing that. Yeah, I'm interested in anything to do with engaging with people better, particularly vulnerable and older people, technology, entrepreneurship, and getting stuff done. So if you're interested in any of those things, please reach out to me. And I'd just like to say thank you for those of you who came, and thank you, Matt, for hosting another one of your wonderful roundtables.
You're very welcome. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for Alertacall support, and thank you for, I think, providing some really, really interesting insight today that I know a lot of people are kind of saying couldn't make it, can't wait to watch the recording back. So yeah, please reach out to me or James if you want that information on the PDF as well. But for now, huge thank you, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Cheers. Thanks, James.
Thanks, folks. Nice to meet you
Thanks
all.
all.
Thank you for listening to the Social Housing Roundtable. Please like and subscribe wherever you find your podcasts, or on our YouTube channel to never miss an episode, or reach out to Matthew Baird on LinkedIn for free access to future events.